All right, we are back, and I am on day one of let's see if we can start this without a lengthy 20-minute digressive introduction challenge. I'll keep you posted on how that's going. So today, I'd like to discuss a question that I posted. For those who see my postings, you may have seen it. If you haven't seen it, then I guess the question is why you're not seeing my postings. But the question that I posted for people's consideration was, does worldly knowledge hold any spiritual significance in chassidic teachings and praxis? Something roughly like that. This isn't consciously coming in continuation by hemshich to our previous discussions about chachmas chitzonius. Got a lot of feedback on that. There's probably more I could add on that topic. So this was not intentionally building on that, continuing from that, but often things are connected in interesting ways. This is actually focusing more on the chasid of this week, Parshas Beha'aloscha, and how a certain passage there that seems perhaps rather innocuous actually holds some very interesting ideas that you wouldn't necessarily observe and notice on your own. So this week's chasid has a maimed diber maschel Beha'aloscha Sanedus, which I guess perhaps you could say is the central maimer of this week's chasid. Often different parshas have the more famous maimer, and then there may be other maimarim, other drushim that aren't necessarily as well known and notable. Earlier in the week, I was actually looking into a different drush a bit further on. That's of a very different nature, very interesting. It's clearly from before Liadi. It has a different character. Maybe we'll still get to that before Shabbos. We'll see. But here's an example of a regular standard maimer. Dare I say that sometimes the standard famous maimer could perhaps come across to some, unfortunately, as, I don't want to use the word boring, but pedestrian, ho-hum. Obviously, to those who aren't familiar, who haven't learned it before, it could be more exciting, but maybe to those who are familiar with the mamarim or the general themes, maybe it's not as interesting as exciting. But I want to focus on a passage here in this Likutei Torah and demonstrate that there's actually there are some very interesting ideas here, like I said. So if you take a look at this maimer, so talks about Avarabba versus Avas Olam, which seems to be the kind of themes you see in other places as well. But it does seem like when discussing this inyan, often one is mitzayin taka to this maimer Beha'aloscha in the Likutei Torah. And in the context and discussion of Avarabba and Avas Olam, so if you look towards the beginning of Ois Gimel, after having discussed it somewhat in Ois Beis as well, but the way it sort of summarizes the topic at the beginning of Ois Gimel is, V'hini kol ze mailas madregas bechinas Avram Avinu alav hashalom, she'ava zu nikra avas olam, ki nilkacha mi bechinas olam makom uzman. This is Avram Avinu's darga, and this ava that's being described here is called avas olam. Why is it called avas olam? So I wasn't planning on getting into this, but we know that there's a big chakira about the word olam in Tanakh and Chazal. There's olam in the sense of eternity, and there's olam in the sense of world. And you have the Mishnah and Brachas that amru ein olam ela echad, so iskinu leimer min olam v'ad ha'olam. But so there's this question as to what olam means. So l'chayra, when you read avas olam, l'chayra means an eternal love. But the Alter Rebbe is going with this Taichin Chazal that you see in multiple places, that olam is miloshin, this world. And so avas olam means a love of the world, a love from the world. What's pshat? A love of the world, a love from the world. This love is derived from this world within time and space. In the sense of how the world is bottled to the Eibishter, and the Ava is derived from that. And it's called Mimata Lamaila, like Avram is Holech v'Nesaya Hanegba, you're climbing, you're going upwards. This is the Avodah Sa'adam, Pulchana Dirchimusa, the Avodah of Ava, Mimadreg Madreg Kanal. Okay, so if you actually sit and you read it slowly, you touch each word, that itself is geschmack and is meaningful. But there's not much elaboration here. So maybe Stamazoi, we would say, if I took a foreign, okay, so now I know there's something called Avas Olam. So for that reason, I would like to call attention to the fact that there's actually a very lengthy beer of the Rebbe Rashab on this Maimer, on this passage of the Maimer, And it's not in his Mamarim, it's Dafka in Sefer HaSichos Toras Shalom. Sefer HaSichos Toras Shalom is its own interesting, really fascinating work. It's the first collection of sichos, of farbrengens, of non-mimer-like Toras, although I've argued before that perhaps in the collection of Alter Rebbe's writings and teachings, I mean not writings in the sense that he wrote them, but the writings of what the Alter Rebbe taught, which technically is also connected to today's Hayom Yom. I got a few requests maybe to focus on that today. We're not going to focus directly on that right now, but this idea of the evolution in the tone and the style of the Alter Rebbe's teachings. So it has been argued, or I have argued that not all of it necessarily should be classified and labeled and tagged as a mimer. Some of it also seems to be, well, first of all, it could be mamish divrei, stuff that he said in Chassidus to people, was also written and transcribed at that time. In some cases, it's pretty clear that's what it is. But it's printed among the volumes of Mamari Admar Zaken. But even in addition to that, I believe that there are many passages that are of a more of a sicha nature, but there was no term or definition, or they didn't differentiate in the writings at the time. And then ultimately, every teaching of the Alter Rebbe was then sort of considered later to be worthy of being the basis of a future mimer, of a future formal drush. So it all sort of gets treated as mimer material, but I think in the original context, some of it would have been much more clearly not a formal mimer or drush, just Alter Rebbe spoke up and shared a vart, shared an insight that occurred to him, and that was recorded without the distinction being made explicit. So, but aside from that, and that's not its own genre, they weren't collected separately per se. So the Rebbe Rashab's Toras Shalom is really the first such work that collects many of the things the Rebbe Rashab said at the Farbrengens. Of course, there'd be room to sit and discuss and analyze the history of Farbrengen, or the history of the term Farbrengen, and what we know about it with the Rebbeim over the years, or even in the parallel, the Chatzar of Kapust. We know there are transcriptions in the Kapistic Hisvayad of things that the Kapistic Rebbe of Shlomo Zalman Schneerson spoke about on various occasions. So it was a trend, I guess, that was coming into view. It was becoming more common to write these things down. I think there's at least in one place on one occasion we do have a transcription of the Rebbe Marash and what he spoke about at a particular occasion. But with all of those disclaimers out of the way, the Rebbe Rashab's Toras Shalom is still the first work of its kind that then sort of predicted the much wider output of the Frierdiker Rebbe on this count, which then sort of predicted or foreshadowed the Rebbe's much, much greater output on this count, to the extent that with the Rebbe it's almost the inverse, that the Iker by the Rebbe almost was the other types of talks and discussions, and the Mamarim can sometimes almost be seen as, I don't know if it's appropriate or correct to say secondary, but it's possible to focus much more on the Rebbe's sichos even than on the Rebbe's Mamarim. Whereas up until then, obviously, the Mamarim were the Iker output of the Rebbeim, and that's its own, we can, I guess, elaborate on that a bit more if you wanted. But keeping focused, so we have Sefer Sichos Toras Shalom, and it's a bit of a dense work. Maybe I don't know if I want to say impenetrable. It's not an easy read. Let's put it that way. You know, there are plenty of things the Frierdiker Rebbe, plenty of sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe that you could say make for an easy read. At least you could read it on an easy and a simple level and enjoy it. Whereas the Rebbe Rashab's speech is very, very dense. It's clearly operating in a different intellectual universe than most of us, and it's a bit hard to place oneself in that environment and just start reading. I'm not aware of how common it is to just go through the Sefer. It's not something I think people spend a lot of time focusing on. And that's, I guess, true for myself as well. Can't say I've gone through it, but like many things, often it's easier, more geschmack, to land on something in the Sefer via something else. You're learning something else, and it's mitzayent it, or in this case, it wasn't a footnote, a reference, a tziyun that I saw, but I landed on it. I'll explain a bit later how I ended up here. But I believe that in many cases, landing on a particular passage of a heavier work is probably a lot more productive, more likely to be productive than just trying to take a crack at it from page one. And as always, that's yet another topic that we could probably talk about more, talking about the Rebbe and the Rebbe's footnotes. The Rebbe turned footnotes into its own genre. When you talk about a sikha, half the sikha is the sikha, half the sikha is the footnotes. And the Rebbe on a number of occasions spoke about the significance of the footnotes. And I think those who really want to learn the way the Rebbe intended for his teachings to be learned should really be spending at least 50% of their time, if not more, actually directly exploring the sources, the footnotes, because the Rebbe is speaking in a particular context, and the Rebbe very consciously, actively stated that, I think, in my opinion, that it should be learned this way, read this way, viewed this way. There's always this question, many layers of Chassidus, as to how much previous context do you need. Like a big example of this is how much Kabbalistic context do you need. That's a bit more controversial, you could say, as to whether there's a need and it's necessary to be familiar with the context. But the context for Kabbalah generally versus Chassidus generally. But I think in the context of the Rebbe's teachings, I think the Rebbe very much wanted it to be known and understood that what he's coming to say, what he's coming to add, is very clearly building on the previous sources and can really, or should really only be appreciated in that context. But that's all Maimer HaMuskar. And let's get back to the point at hand. So if you look in Sefer HaSichos Shalom, from page 87 till page 112, don't worry, we're not going to go through the entire thing, but those pages, on those pages you will find the Sikha of Simchas Torah Tafresh Samaches B'Seuda B'Zal HaGodel. As we know, that was one of the 3 dates, I believe, when the Rebbe Rashab would verbring at length, another one being Yutas Kislev, and the third one is escaping me at the moment. But Simchas Torah, big percentage of the talks in Torah Shalom are from Simchas Torah, and so this is one of them, is obviously Samaches, plenty of years into Temchet Mimim, and presumably these verbringens were for the Talmidim of Temchet Mimim. I don't know if it was for all of them or for a select few, whatever the Seder was. That's probably its own topic. So this is the Rebbe Shabbat verbringen. These are often, generally, typically written by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and in fact, in many of them, including in this one, you'll sometimes see ha'aris in the middle, where it will say Yud Yud or something like that, where the Frierdiker Rebbe is adding his own parenthetical ha'aris in addition to what his father said. But it seems that they were generally recorded, transcribed by the Frierdiker Rebbe at the time. So you have Simchas Torah Tafresh Samaches, and interestingly, the way this verbringen starts is reminiscent of how many of the Frierdiker Rebbe's verbringen start, where the Rebbe Rashab says, "Frivel chayich terzählen am Meise from the Rebbe," but which he meant the Alter Rebbe up until around the Rebbe Rashab, maybe the Frierdiker Rebbe as well. The Stam Rebbe and Chabad meant the Alter Rebbe. So terzählen am Meise from the Rebbe. That will be Agdama. He says, Amal Simchas Torah, hat the Rebbe also gesagt, he's like chazering a Torah, a Shmuel, that the Alter Rebbe said in Simchas Torah, which again, like I said, the Frierdiker Rebbe has many of such descriptions, depictions, so it's interesting to see the Rebbe Rashab do something like that as well. So at any rate, whatever, I'm not going to, obviously we're going to have to be judicious in what we quote, what we don't quote, we can't overdo it, but he's quoting something from the Alter Rebbe about Ava Rabba versus Avas Olam. Ava Rabba, every year has Ava Rabba. Avas Olam, that's the Madrega, was given by Avraham Avinu. And he elaborates a bit more, the Rebbe Rashab quoting the Alter Rebbe, and then he says again, Noch hat der Rebbe gesagt jemalt, as Ava Rabba hat jeder Yid, kol ach wechem Yisrael yesh le Ava Zois, nor was denn, sie ist Muster in Elam, und Avas Olam, das ist der Fall, und Madregas Ava, was is gewähm by Avraham Avinu Hashem. Interesting use of the word Fall, unless I'm missing something. That itself is interesting linguistic choice, but not going to focus on that. And then it continues, this is already the Rebbe Rashab saying this, but it goes straight into the next sentence, which is, und das is masim, gleicht sich ois, which is also an interesting linguistic note, because the Rebbe used masim a lot in Yiddish speech. The Rebbe used masim, the Hebrew word. And masim itself, is, if I'm not mistaken, a fairly late Hebrew word, may be an invention of the last 200 years. So it's interesting that in this writing, which is the Frierdiker Rebbe, so he writes masim, and then in parentheses, gleicht sich ois. So that's how one would have expressed it before the word masim came along. Das gleicht sich ois, mit dem, was steht in the Likutei Torah, Parshas Bahaloischa, b'dibur hamascha Bahaloischa ha'alef, the is Hashem, the Ba'avedas Hashem, yesh beis madregas Ava, ha'alef, ha'ava shinam shechas kamayim, ha'beis, ha'ava kodesh v'esh, and it goes on as we'll see by Riches, but it's really alluding to the fact that in this Baha'u'llah it talks about Ava Kamaim, Ava Krish Ve'esh, but then ultimately this connects to the union of Ava Rabba and Avas Oilam. So whatever the Rebbe Rashab is repeating from the Alter Rebbe, from Simchas Torah, about Ava Rabba and Avas Oilam, connects, is the Teichen of the Kutei Torah, Parshas Ba'aleischa, Dibur Maschel Ba'aleischa, so the Taka, the Maimer that we're being Isaac in right now. And like I said, it's a long Verbringen. We're not going to go through all of it, but I want to call out a number of passages throughout the Verbringen where the Rebbe Rashab defines Avas Oilam. So if you look a bit later, at the end of Ois Daled, page 91, so we're going to have to really cut sharply here and only quote the passages that are in Ager, or else Einod over Seif. So the passage we're focusing on here, Rebbe Rashab says, often in this writing, even though it's ostensibly a Yiddish hanacha, but often the Frierdiker Rebbe in particular lapses into just writing in Hebrew. So it's sort of on and off, depending on which passage you're looking at. So here it's mostly Hebrew. So page 91, it says that V'yesh b'chinas ava karish v'yesh shenase al yedei avodas ha'adam me'atzmai. V'hu b'chinas avas oilam. So we're talking about kamayim karish v'yesh. So in this framework, this ava karish v'yesh is something that a person does himself, works on himself, and that's avas oilam. What is avas oilam? Ava haba'a al yedei ha'oilam dafka. Ava that comes from the oilam. Okay, so this is still sort of building on what we already began with from Kutei Torah. That's the pshat in oilam. It means velt. Avas oilam from velt. But here's the way the Rebbe Rashab is going to define it here is fairly interesting to me. This is what the Rebbe Rashab says. Ava haba'a yedei ha'oilam dafka. The kesheroyev v'noisein aliboy. Call in yani ha'olam uprateyam chulu. When a person sees and a person pays attention to all the yani ha'olam and the details, mizeh ba la'ava la'Hashem. From this one comes to love Hashem. Hapirashu pshat is shal yidei in yani ha'olam dafka through veltzachem ba lidei dvekus ve'eskashrus. That's what brings the person to connect, to cleave to the Eibishter. Then he goes on and says, Be'emes, Avas Oilam itself has both kinds of Ava. There's Nefshachas Kamayim and there's Kiddush V'esh. We're not going to get into the technicalities of the framework. I want to focus more on this general idea of Avas Oilam being Al Yedei Ha'olam Dafka. So in order to keep with this part of the theme of what Avas Oilam is, you have to keep on jumping along every few pages. The Rebbe Rashab continues to elaborate on what he means. So if you look a bit further, page 92, in the middle of Ois Hey, where he returns to this point. He says, Masha'enke no ava habeis shehi avas oilam, he begiloi. It's revealed kind of love. Pirish'en aleh halomes ve'estadim klau. It's not covered over. It's not hidden. The kasha ma'oid ad shaboim l'madregas avas. It's not very difficult to attain, to reach, to achieve this ava. Aval acher shabo eleha hainu l'madregasa he eina kasha klau. Once you achieve it, once it clicks, once you get it, then it's not difficult, then it's begiloi, it's no halamas v'estadim. And then here comes this very interesting definition. It says, the ba'avazu, why is it not hard? The ba'avazu, in this love, kol inyani ha'olam ma'ilam hazeh. All the zachan of the velt, all inyanim of velt, pashut help, they pashut contribute, they add, they give to the ava. Pirush, what's pshat? The kol ma shemevin yoiser, the inyani ha'olam, Vas mer, the more a person understands Weltsachen, al yada, let's say Rashi Tevis, but through this, Yiskadel v'yisrachev etzlei ha'ava b'yoser. So the more the ava will grow and broaden. L'fisha kol ha'ava hu mi'nyani ha'olam, because the entire love is derived from matters of the world, Weltsachen. That's the lashon of the Torah. That's why it's called Avas Oilam, because it's taken from Oilam Makan Uzman. What's the definition of that? The definition of that is that kol inyani Oilam ma'ilam lazeh, kol ma shemev yoser b'nyan Oilam dei zeh, or whatever yiskal v'yisrachav etzlei ava b'yoser, b'she kol ha'ava hu me'inyani Oilam. So you could see mamish the next. I don't know if they're mitzayin in the sefer or not. But the next couple of lines is literally just a direct quote from what we were just quoting from the Torah. So literally the way this text is edited, it's like a Chassidus Muvares almost on the Likkutei Torah. It's interpolating these Hisafis into the original text from the Likkutei Torah. So it says, therefore, it's hard to reach this. It's hard to get it. Hard to make it click. But once you got it, so then it's like you have endless fuel, because whatever the more Yoni Ha'olam you encounter, the more it adds to your Ava. So it's great if you can get it. He continues and he says here, this is the mitzvah of Avraham Avinu. Shedafke min Yoni Ha'olam boli de dveikus ve'eskashus v'chinas erin seif baruch hu. Umaysa avis simon labanim shezois hayerusha hinchul labanav achrav liyas be'efsharis adam lahasi b'chinazu, and we have it inherited from Avram that we can also attain this, and that's holach v'nesaya hanagba. And he goes on at length, not such great length, but a bit on this about Avraham Avinu and his darga. And Avraham Avinu Taka achieved this. V'dafka b'vchinas avas oilam, ava haba meha oilam v'inyan of dafka. And it's dafka, an ava that comes from the world, and it's inyanim. U'kameikenu b'chalech v'achad. Any person sheyachal hagia yedei ribu avoda l'bchinas ava zois. It takes a lot of work, but anyone through a lot of work can attain this ava. Like we say, masi yigu ma'aseh l'ma'aseh avoisai. So anyone can aspire to reach this. Yesh b'kayach kol echad v'echad l'hagia l'zeh. And he adds, and it goes back to this point, one thing we don't struggle with is getting the world, hopping the world. We all, the world is relatable. No one's going to, sometimes it comes to Chassidus and you have to think about this, think about that. So you could say, I don't know, it's not so relatable to me. So the Rebbe Shab is saying, but here, everyone understands the world. So that's the most relatable thing. That's the most relatable part. You versteht Yoni Ha'olam, that's your thing. So if you come and you say, okay, I know Yoni Ha'olam, great start. You're a candidate. Now you can attain this Ava with the greatest Dvekas Ve'eskashrus. The Liyois Klaus Brias Veshavas Ha'elamis who bechdei shayidei zeh yiskadav yiskadesh shemay yisbarach b'vchinas avod dveikus, because that's what the worlds exist for. Everything exists to attain this yiskadav yiskadesh shemay yisbarach avod dveikus. So if you've been engaging with the world, so then that's perfect. Now you just need to channel and reach this perspective that everything you know from the world is to achieve this avod dveikus, and that, of course, has the effect that Hashem's name is Yiskadol v'Yiskadesh. It's great and it's holy, sanctified. So either that sentence is either him saying that's the reason why it works, or that's what you should be thinking. You should be thinking this, and therefore it will lead to this, whatever the exact formulation is. So this is what the Rebbe Rashab is saying, and the Rebbe is writing it. And then, like I said, it sort of jumps. There's other points and topics and themes, but I'm really sticking strictly to this. A bit later, page 93, in Ois Vav, also in the middle, it says, D'zeu ha'hafresh kloli beis b'chinas ava elu, ava kiddush v'yesh versus ava kamayim. Again, we're not getting into that. And then again, ubeis madregas elu, both of these ube madregas avas oilam. You have both of these within the realm of avas oilam. And again, what's avas oilam? Hainu be'in yoni ha'oilam, love relating to the matters of the world. Umein yoni ha'oilam ha'pirashu. So avas oilam we're defining as in yoni ha'oilam. And how are we defining in yoni ha'oilam? The Taich is, was von in yoni ha'oilam dafke konner der Herren die Zugetrockenkeit von Nevroim zu Beire. And it translates it into Hebrew, that from dafke, from the Welt, you can feel, you can sense that his achtos. Again, interesting to see the translation that his achtos in Hebrew is the Zugetrockenkeit in Yiddish of the creations with the Beire. Und das Gufa, dem Hergish, dem der Herr, filtered in yoni ha'olam Gufa. And this sense, this feeling, it's something that you're literally like feeling and deriving in the yoni ha'olam. So it's not, you're not running away, you're not separating yourself. The engagement, interaction with yoni ha'olam feeds this sense that there's the Zugetragenkeit, this Achtos of Nevraim to the Beire. Then he fears again, Lafi, Shal Yodai, Hani Oidai, Yoni Ha'elam, Balak Falas Av Hazois, Valachi Nikris Avazu B'Shem Avas Oilam, Kinukacham, Yoni Ha'elam, Makmuz Managashmi, again, sort of returning and repeating that line from the Alter Rebbe, from the source. So it always comes back to that. That's the Pshat, that it's Avas Oilam. And of course, there's much more there, Arum and Arum, this Inyam, but these are the highlights. Look a bit further there, page 97, the end of Is Yud. So it says there, K'baykein is das b'chol evdei Hashem, die Ave Zer is b'fchinas Avas Oilam dafke, hat angehabt Avram in sein Madriges Av und sein Avoide, aber bei Emes ist das so b'chlal bei evdei Avaya, as die Ave Zer is b'fchinas Avas Oilam, don't think it's just Avram, it's all evdei Hashem. And then here's the Haggah from the Frierdiker Rebbe, Aleph Yud Yud. Omar, and the Frierdiker Rebbe is referring to himself, seemingly. Varam das muss doch so sein. Has to be this way, because why is there a world? The reason why the world is created is for the yichud, to be meyached, the Eibishter's presence, dafka in the world, and then the worlds are elevated. Nimtza avdei Hashem shem ha'oivdim ikar aveidasim hu b'nyani ha'elam dafka. So the whole point is to engage with the world. Shkol echad v'echad tzarich l'shtadlu madregas avazu b'chtei shal yada yushlam kavanas hamachuvim haberdi yisparich shechavetz b'vriyas v'shavas ha'elmuchu. This is the whole point, this is the whole purpose. You have to connect the world, unify the world with the Creator. It's hard. I'm not saying it's easy, it's hard. It's but that's the ultimate point. That's how it's being framed. Like really, that's the ultimate kavana, is to unify the world with its source. So you have to see this alikus within the world dafka, and it's interacting with the Yoni Ha'elam, and then you're being mashlam the mechuven. See also further along, Yud Beis, page 99, page 100, more descriptions, definitions of Avas Olam. There he expresses it like this. He says, when a person's in the state of Avas, of Avad Abba, so then that severs you from the world. It is Yamot Nitshayach Tzun Yoni Olam Klal. You're sort of removed from this world. But by Avas Olam Nit Nishtana Musa Klal, your personality, your type, your Inyan doesn't change. He uses the framework from Tanya of a Tzaddik Gomer versus a Tzaddik She'ena Gomer. And even a Tzaddik She'ena Gomer, we're saying that he's not Moyes Beras, so he's not fully disconnected from the world. And we're talking about someone even lower than that. So versteht man ganz gut, als ist noch nicht Nishtana geworden im Etzem Musa Klal, als so nicht haben kein Sheiches zur Welt. It's not like a person's transformed and now they're of no connection, no interest in the world. Was then, Sevelt Be'emes, Hoter, yeah, Sheiches. No, person's connection to the world is the same. Nor in the Espashta Zaynim. You're not allowing the Nefesh Bahamas to take control, that's why it's Betel Hayesh, etc., etc. And you have to daven every day, and if you daven and a Gashmistic thing comes along, then you'll taka not want it, but if you don't daven, be a starf to Zayin, so then Tavar Gashmi comes along, you will want it. And he returns to this definition. The Ava Montnet Oif as Erzo Taka Kain Shum Shayches Hoppen Su Yoni Oilam. That's not what the Ava is demanding, that's not what it's asking, to be disconnected from the world. Nor das Mont Oif as Erzo Shayach Zayin Tzakima Terdo Mitzvah. So Mekamakim Halter noch Ba in Yoni Oilam Oich. The whole Choven Maskana of the Bechein, of the Ava, is that you have to remain in Welt. That's why you need to work on this Ava, and that's the Bechina Madrigas Ava Varom Avinu. Taka, a lot of Yigi, a lot of work goes into this Ava, and that's why we call him Avram Evi, because he worked so hard on this Ava. And the same goes for Evdei Hashem, that they have this Ava of Avas Oilam. And again, it takes a lot of work, etc., etc. Ad kan, pretty much what we're going to excerpt from this talk of Simchas Torah, Tafich Samaches, in Sefer HaSichos Torah Shalom. So what does this mean, or what do I think it means? So let's try to unpack it a little bit. Well, behektem, that I've tried classifying before in my mind, we're different among the strains in Judaism that hold of hisbonenus, being misbonen in something, to bring to Avos Hashem, because obviously there are some strains of Judaism, streams that don't really consider that to be an official value that they hold of. But if you look at those of all kinds who have spoken of some sort of hisbonenus, so I've thought about this before, and I've sort of sorted it in my head into a few categories. So the way I had it sorted in my head was, you could say there's 3 or 4 categories. One, to my mind, is the Rambam. You look in the Rambam, in the first 4 prakim, Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. So he has his definition, his agdara of Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis, which, if you understand the context which the Rambam was coming from, so essentially he seems to be using existing categories within the world of philosophy and science of physics and metaphysics. So if you study the metaphysics, so then that's Maisa Merkava, and if you study the physics, so that's the section that speaks about the G-dliness, where the Rambam simply breaks down the scientific building blocks of the science of the time. That's my Havana of it. So that's what he calls Maisa Bereshis. And he's saying the reason why this is here in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, why this is Jewish information, is because this is what you need to study, and this is what you need to be misbeinen in to achieve Avas Hashem, which he states explicitly. So this is the material. This is what you should be focusing on. So presumably, according to the Rambam, if you study about the Chassidus and you think about it and you really grasp the whole system, and you're misbeinen in that, that's going to bring you to Avas Hashem. So that's one category. Then you have Kabbalah. So let's say, according to Kabbalah, according to Arizal, let's simplify it and say you have to be misbeinen in the mechanisms of the spheres, of what's happening Lamaila and Atzilos, and what's happening in davening. You would have to go check to see how explicitly they speak about hisbonenus and Avas Hashem as a value versus being mechaven and being poil and being mamshech hamshachas. But let's assume that that's also a value that it's going to lead to Avas Hashem. And then you have Chassidus Chabad, that says to take that world of Kabbalah seemingly, but to be misbeinen specifically on the point that there's bittul oilamus to the Eibusher, and often the hisbonenus is described as thinking about the malachim and those spiritual realms and how they're all batal to the Eibusher. So focusing pretty much exclusively on the nakuda of bittul oilamus to the Eibusher. So that's, you could say, the third category. And fourth category, maybe some will smile, but I grew up, I knew the name Victor Miller, and Victor Miller had his own interesting ideas and shittas. Some of them are more controversial, but I think in many ways I do respect the fact that he had a certain mahalach and he had certain ideas that were worked out, in his idea of Avodas Hashem. So one of the things that he pushed, that he pioneered, that has had a certain degree of influence on the frum world, maybe even a little bit on the Hamish Welt today, is this idea of sort of being misbeinen in Gashmias Ha'olam lefi the knowledge, the up-to-date knowledge that we have today. So he would say, take an apple and study all the details of the apple, which the Rambam himself doesn't quite say to do. The Rambam is speaking more on the level of physics, larger rules that govern how the world works. The Rambam doesn't get into minimum of apples and pratim like that. But Victor Miller, he pushed for this idea that you sit and you be misbeinen in how an apple works, how the eyeball works, tafkelefi, all the ideas that we have today, how breathing works, things like that. And I take it seriously. I think it's an interesting contribution to Jewish thought. So that's the fourth category. These are four things one might think about. So as over the years, as I've thought about it, and I can recall myself thinking about this in a very basic form, even many years ago, maybe even as a teenager, and I was sort of contrasting in my mind of Victor Miller, let's say, to Chassidus. So my mind is, okay, Victor Miller says to think about Gashmias Ha'olam, and the Chassidus seemingly doesn't think that that's a thing. Chassidus is always talking about being misbeinen, and this and that all seems very holy, very supernal, very abstract, not to sit and think about an apple. But now, in light of this, and in light of a few sources I'm going to quote shortly, I think it's interesting to think about this and to reevaluate what exactly Chassidus says to think about and whether my assessment was true. Because if we take what the Rebbe Rashab is saying here and we apply it, what it sounds like the Rebbe Rashab is saying is that actually, in Yani Ha'olam, matters of this world, stuff that we know about from this world, are actually can be the subject of hisbonenus. And you think about that, and you think about how the world is batal to the Eibusher, and you think about it in terms, though, of the things that you are familiar with in the world. So he keeps on emphasizing that it takes Yigia to get there, but once you get there, then anything in the world could be material for hisbonenus, could be material for the Ava. It's fodder for the Ava, the Avas Olam, the Ava Mitoich Olam. Now, another place where you'll find this discussed a bit is found is a Rishim of the Frierdiker Rebbe from a year later, Tafir Samach Tes. At that point, the Frierdiker Rebbe was already writing Rishimis, and they're often printed as hisafis to the Sifrei Mamorim of the Rebbe Shab of that year. So there's Sefer Mamorim Tafir Samach Tes, and in the hisafis there's a Rishimis of the Frierdiker Rebbe from that year. So there's a Rishima there, Mikveh Yisrael, printed on page Shimpei Zayin, Shimpei Ches, in the edition that I was looking at. And there, the Frierdiker Rebbe is being Isaac in this noise again. He talks about Ava Kamayim and the definition of Mayim that he uses there. At any rate, it says Va'ava Zoyes Nikres Avas Oilam. She bechinas Ava Hanases Mi Inyoni Oilam. Again, I'm sort of repeating this definition. The Ksiv Gamas Oilam Nosan Baliboy. That the world is in your heart. What does that mean? If you have to put your mind to the world, if you pay attention to the matters of the world, start thinking about the multiplicity in the world. And once I'm saying this, many of you may be thinking of related Makaitis. I'll get to in a second. You think about the multiplicity of the Nevraim and the Seder and how they work, and so speaking about up in Shemayim, the big the Shemesh, the big ones, the G'dayli HaNevraim, as he says in a moment. Shemesh v'Reich Kechavim Shehagam Shehei Migdayli HaNevraim. They're so big, and yet they also require Chidush Tmidi, this vart of Chassidus Chabad, that if you think about the Chidush Tmidi, the Yesh Me'ayin, Kamoy HaNevraim HaYeser K'tanim, just like the smallest ones. So that's Bashamayim Mimal. And Ba'aretz Mitachas, Beribui Min, Bruim, the multiplicity of how many Bruim there are. So Mizahu Makar G'dulasi Yizbarach. From that, you recognize Hashem's greatness, Echshu Mamali Kol Almen, etc. And he goes on and says, when we say Almen, we mean Hein Oilamis, Hein Abruim, Shehem Nimtsoim Bil Oilamis, the Eibishter fills it all, Vatam Achayas Kulam. Hashem is present in all of them. So Dafkin, the Ribui, but Mimal, Amitachas, the Eibishter is present in all of that. He goes on and describes it a bit more at length, or more of the hisbonenus side of it. And he says, the more you think about this, the more you'll accomplish, the more you'll reach. Obviously, it's all turning back around to the idea of the bittul, everything's nothing. But to appreciate that should make an impact. So one of the ingredients is dafka being misbainin in Yoni Oilam and the Ribui Mimal and Mitachas, and that they are all betelim umuvitalim. By the way, I should mention that we have the Sefer Erkim. That's how we pronounce it in Chabad, even though in Ivrit it's Arachim, but commonly called Sefer Erkim by Rabbi Yochanan, Chelik Aleph. So you have Avas Hashem, Avas Oilam. So if you look there, you'll see that in the definition of Avas Oilam, Mitaka, along the presentation there, mentions this vart, this definition, that it's Dafka Minyani Oilam, and I think at one point even brings the line that from Torah Shalom at Kol Ma, the more you know, which we'll return to, the more you know, that's like to this adds to your Avas Oilam, and he's mitzayin there in Ha'ara 104 to the Torah Shalom Taka. So he incorporated Taka that into the Hagdar, into the definition. Obviously, it's still somewhat of a dry presentation overall, but it's part of the official definition, you could say. Now, this inyan, this Teichen, is cited by the Rebbe Bekitzer in a Maimer Ba'aloischa Tavshim Memchas, where in the later years the Rebbe often sort of summarized, give an overview of certain mamarim, certain sugyas. So in Ba'aloischa Memchas, the Rebbe says in Yinhu that the Av of Avram is Avas Oilam. It's sort of tracking along with Likutei Torah. The Echad HaPirushim B'Tayar Zeh Avas Oilam Hu. One of the Taichin is She'ava Nilkacha Mei HaHisbonenus Be'Elikus Sheben Yoni Oilam Hazeh Hatachtim Mod Abu Masecha Uma Godlu Masecha. So the Rebbe is alluding Bekitzer to this vart. That's what's the gather Avas Oilam. That's in Emtzich. It's from thinking about Elikus in the Yoni HaOilam. And the Rebbe adds Mod Abu Masecha Uma Godlu Masecha. Then the Rebbe goes on and to talk about the Maila of this Ava, the Chesaron of this Ava. Fine. But the Rebbe throws in Mod Abu Masecha Uma Godlu Masecha. So it's actually interesting to think about the role that Morabu Masecha, Magad Masecha has in Chassidus Bechlal, because this would be another direction to look in to see how these are invoked in Chassidus. Now, I didn't set out to look for all the places where Morabu and Magadu are mentioned Bechlal. There probably are more. But in a number of places, Taka mentioned that from Marabu Magadlu, person achieves Ava. It's in a Hemshechayim base somewhere. The Rebbe in a few Mamorim throughout the years would say this, that person's misboinen in Magadlu Masacha, Marabu Masacha. One place in Va'era, Tafshalam Test, where it says it is, a person's misboinen in Magadlu Marabu, Oy Bishar Yoni hisbonenus, or other matters, Shrei Kolachel Mispoil, Me'asechel, Hashayach Elov, Kmavur, Bakdam Satanya, whatever does it for you, whatever you find I would say I want to get to is whatever you find interesting. The term here is kolachad mispoil, but mispoil me'asechel hashayach elov. But essentially, what I'd like to argue is that part of what we're saying here is that you should be thinking about what you find interesting. So this is something that I've actually mentioned a number of times, sometimes not specifically in the context of Avas Olam, but I think even in some places in the context of Avas Olam, when the Rebbe would mention Avas Olam, and in this Hagdara, this definition, the Rebbe would say, Avas Olam, you're mizbenenin, marabu magadlu. Interestingly, an interesting place where I saw the Rebbe use marabu magadlu is actually in a letter to Reb Hendel Lieberman, the artist, that in a letter from Vav Nissen, Tav Shalom and Hey, the Rebbe added, and probably was a form letter for Pesach, but at the end, the Rebbe added in Ksavet Kodesh, Bevirchas HaChag Ulevrius, Ulenitzel Kishroinei HaNayla, Betzior Magadlu Geimer Marabu Masacha Havaya Mitech Simcha. So interestingly, the Rebbe invoked it for Reb Hendel's artistic abilities, which perhaps even opens a larger discussion about the Rebbe's attitude and engagement with the world of art, which has been discussed recently and written about recently, and I'm not going to go directly into that right now, but the interesting overlap where the Rebbe is sort of using this chassidic term, this chassidic hagdara, to say that what Reb Hendel is doing fits within the framework of contributing or being mizbeinin in magadlu and marabu masacha. Now, where do we find the good hagdara of marabu magadlu in Torah Chassidus? So one place to look is in Torah Parshas Va'era, Vayedaber, Chulu, Va'era, V'chulu. And there on page Nunvav, column Beis, this is what the Alter Rebbe says, V'hine ksiv, marabu masacha, ksiv magadlu masacha. What's marabu masacha? In this framework here, marabu, that's the element setachtoinin, the kol habruim shabaylam haza. And these creatures, these creations, some eschalkim lemineihem, mekama minei eschalkos, ribei ravavis madregas, bedoim tzemeach chai, shekama minei doimim, mekama minei tzemeach. So the Alter Rebbe is actually sort of taking the time to elaborate and to paint a picture of this ribui that we have in Olam Haza. Okay, that's still a general point. Okay, there's thousands, there's tens of thousands, or tens of them, maybe millions. Maybe that's what ribui ravavis is, an older way of saying millions of madregas. Okay. Then Alter Rebbe goes on, it says, "V'kol min v'min, yesh le tam b'fnei atzmai." And every min has its own tam. K'mei tapuchim, ve'egoizim, u'shkedim. The Alter Rebbe is getting into the details. Apples, and there's nuts, and there's almonds, and everyone has its own tam. So that's an example of 3 out of the millions. So that's one example. V'chayetze behem b'tzemeach, and like other things, shekol echad yesh le tam b'fnei atzmai, she'ena echad doima l'chaveroi. And then you move on to grass. So the Alter Rebbe is actually sort of taking the time to depict and describe it. Think about how all these things exist and think about what they're like and how they're different. Now, where does their tam come from? The tam comes from the mazel, and that's psoilus oilam isol yoinim. And so that's all down here, and that's marabu masacha. And magadlu masacha, that's oilam isol yoinim, halachim neshamis. That's how the Alter Rebbe defines it, describes it there in Torah. Now, if you look in Torah Chaim of the Mitzvah Rebbe, which I've argued before, often describes things. One of the interesting characteristics of the Mitzvah Rebbe is how he will take things Alter Rebbe says b'kitzer and repeat them with a very detailed and vivid description. So we find this for this section as well in the Ve'era in Torah Chaim. And there too, he says there's marabu and there's magadlu, and he starts with magadlu. Magadlu is oilam isol yoinim, but then there's marabu masacha, that's ischalkos, doim tzemeach chai gashmiyim, and he sort of describes that a bit in sort of the technical terms in Chassidus to explain where they fit into the whole mechanism, whole hierarchy of the oilamus. But then he goes on and says, v'yuven zeh hafresh, the context, the way he presents it is, the way he frames it is, that there's oinig lamata, well, b'chlal ein aroich oilamus tachtoinim to oilam isol yoinim, and he's going to give an example in the Indian of Einig, the Indian of Tainug. So when it comes to Tainug, in the Oilamis, Ruchniyim, there's a million madregas. But we're going to compare it to the Tanugim Mazeh Hagashmim down here that come through the Psoilus and all of that. And this is how he describes it. We see, when it comes to Tanugim Gashmim, there are many madregas in every min. So, for example, in Doimim, it says, this Tanugim in Doimim. What are the Tanugim? This Kesef, this Zahav, this Mini Matchis, Avonim Toivis, Margolius, this Minim, Rabba Michulakim, Bo'efen HaTainug. And he says, Gam Ba'afara Aretz Atzma, even in the dirt, the earth itself. But Betuv Mezigas HaYesayid Sheba B'chol Makom Fi Mashahu. So there's so many combinations even within the earth, the minerals of the earth, whatever term you want to use. So that's just starting with the Doimim. Then he says, think about the Tzemeach. In the Tzemeach, Yesh, Kama Mine Peides Mucholakim B'Tameim. Each one has a different taste, but even a Tainuk Shebam, and each one has like a Geschmack. That's the framing we're using. It's the Tainuk. So think about the Tainuk and the Geschmack. Zet Taimei Kach, Bezet Taimei Kach. Ki ribui haminim b'peiros haaretz v'kol asher ba b'tvua v'kol tzemach peri haaretz yesh ribui revaves madregas minim sheinim zemizeh. There's millions of madregas, of the types of fruits and the types of grain and anything that grows. So, and each one is its own geschmack. And then there's rivas madregas of tastes, of flavors of the machal of chai, bakar, tzoin, oifes, dogim, chal of dvash. I'm quoting from the Mittel Rebbe. So think about all the geschmack in the time of the machal. And what about unique human enjoyments? This common meaning tanugim sheinim, like what? There's taivas hamaychel, the desire to eat, and then he says v'taivas hamishkol, the desire to cohabit, which is a theme we spoke about and how it's mentioned sometimes just casually, more often in earlier Chassidus. So he throws it in here. There's taivas hamaychel, taivas hamishkol. These are things that humans enjoy, they desire, they pursue. And this taivas hakovid, taivas gdula, lahasig hoin, to achieve wealth, vinitzuach, vihisbaros, sounds a bit like it's tracking with the, perhaps with the Esher Sfiras. Oi tiol, menucha, maybe you'll enjoy taking trips, or you enjoy resting. These are all things people enjoy, people pursue. Or mochama, or ritzicha, or the opposite, chasid drachmim. Each one, the kulam yesh, taining meyuchad b'fnei atzma. Each one has its own bazundere geschmack. And these are all Tanugim Gashmiyim. These are very lowly Tanugim that fell b'shviras hakelim. We said it's the Psoilus dipsoilus that comes from the higher Tanugim. This sort of does track a bit with hisbonenus we spoke about with the Marash, with being misbonen in one's own Taiva Gashmis, and to consider where it fits in the framework and the hierarchy of the elements. So this is a bit of a similar thing. But here it's saying to think about all the Tanugim, all the Taivas. Then he says, despite the fact that we're talking about very lowly things, like, is this what we even want to talk about? But we see that in Tanugim Agashmim, this is chalkos rav kol kach, there's such a multiplicity, such variation, to millions of madregas, so muchrech lema muzman zagen that b'shay the sharsham, till the highest source, there must also be millions of madregas b'schalkos. Ad sheyesh kama rivas madregas in the Einig Aliyim from the Shamas and Elam Haba. So from being misbayin in the millions of madregas of Geshmak here in Elam Haba, so you get a musig of the millions of madregas of Geshmak, Lamaila, including the Neshamas and Gan Eden. And then he circles back around and says, so you have all of these madregas lamayla, that's my God lamasacha, and then when it comes down, lamata, till the mazalas, till you get to the gashmis, till you get to the tanugim of Doimim Tzemei Chayim Adab Gashmim, like we said before, of them state, marabu masacha, and can't compare the tachtonim to the yoinim, because all we're seeing down here is psilus. Okay, so there is a bit of like being a little dismissive of how lowly it is, but what we're seeing here is that, and especially, like I said, wherever Chassidus takes the time to describe something at length, to paint the picture, is mashma, that one is supposed to be thinking about this at length and painting the picture to oneself. And Chassidus can only do it so much, and you have to sort of personalize it for yourself. So Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe are telling you to think about the flavors of the tapuchim, the agoizim, the shkedim, like the Alter Rebbe says, or all the detailed things that the Mittel Rebbe listed from Doimim and from Tzemeach and from the Chai and all the Tanugim B'nei Adam. He's literally listing a bunch of stuff, and these should all be relatable things. All the different Tanugim B'nei Adam that the Alter Rebbe, that the Mittel Rebbe describes. One could spend an hour thinking about taka the taivas hamayacham, taivas hamishkal, taivas hakavod, bagdula, lahasig hoin, yitzurach, esparis, til, menucha, muhammad, etzicha, chesed, v'rachmim. Thinking about this in a personal, real way would take a while. So there's a lot to think about, and this is all being described as something that one presumably would be misbeinen in, and it would lead to X, Y, and Z. So in that context, it's not using the term avas olam, but the Rebbe seems to be perhaps, I don't know if he's the first or not, to connect, to bridge these two sugyas and say that the hisbonenus of avas olam is the hisbonenus of marabu magadlu. So by thinking about all of these things and then channeling it back to the bittul ha'olamus, so that would be the hisbonenus of avas olam. So what the Rebbe Rashab is saying is that the more you know in Inyani ha'olam, so the more fodder you have of what to think about. So kum tachois, first of all, to the question of, do we think about lowly gashmistic things? So the answer is yes, there's certainly room for it. Do you have to think about it? So the way the Rebbe said it is people think about what they find relatable. So Lomer Zagin, a lot of stuff you heard about Chassidus seemed a bit too abstract, and maybe you weren't so excited about it. But maybe you can see yourself spending some time and thinking about the Gashmias, obviously not just for the sake of thinking about Gashmias, but in this context. So this is Chassidus is saying very explicitly, this is absolutely a very legitimate path of being misbeinen, and obviously at some point you have to bring it back around to the point, which is about the bittul ha'olamus or whatever specific aspect one wants to illustrate, or whether, like the Mittel Rebbe is describing, to think about the ein areich, the tenugim gashmiyim to the tenugim ruchniim, and all that is magadlu, marabu, it's all batal to the Eibishter. So this is an important point that deserves to be highlighted. Is this davar pashut? Maybe some people listening will say, yeah, davar pashut, yeah, maram, magadlu, yeah, they have more marmakaimis. Okay, are people going around saying, actively saying that this is something that Chassidus says to do and this is how to do it? I don't recall encountering it. So I think it's certainly worth highlighting, and especially the way, it's sort of stated in the Chasid, avas olam, okay, from the olam. Here you see what that means, the way that Rebbe Shab teaches it is, where marabu magadlu is teiched elsewhere. But moreover, to bring it a little bit more into the somewhat minorly controversial area of Bechlal being exposed, knowing things of the Welt. So it's interesting how the Rebbe Rashab expressed that the Kol Mashemev and Yoser Ben Yoni Ha'olam Harei Yoda Yiskalo V'Yisrachav Etzle Ha'ava B'Yoser, or a bit later, Varei Kol Echad Masigas Ha'olam V'Yonov V'Me'acha Shemev Nis Yoni Ha'olam Harei Mezeh Yochel Agil L'Bchinas Ha'ava B'Dvekas V'Skasha Yesen Afla. So I want to argue, posit, that there's some things that Chassidus is not going to recommend. Chassidus is not going to come out and tell you, go study about the world. That's obviously not Chassidus' recommendation. However, the reality is that the average person, a normal person, with time, they learn about the Welt, whether mamash behechrach gomer, or whether they're not utilizing every minute of their day for Torah, which obviously is just is the norm, is the reality. So what the Rebbe Rashab seems to be saying is, I can't tell you to go study about a Yoni Ha'olam, but it happens to be that if you have the right attitude, so the more Yoni Ha'olam you encounter, you can always channel it back and feed it back into one's hisbonenus. Just recently, there's the Kovetz Ginzaya that publishes rare or unpublished documents from Chabad history. So they just printed the Kovetz about Shmuel Michal Treinen, one of the Chassidim of the Rebbe Rashab, and it mentions there, in the biographical details, that he had a metal a factory that was being Isaac in metal, whatever the correct exact precise term would be. But it sounded like that at some point he went to Chutz La'aretz, he went out of Russia, he went to one of the more western lands to study metallurgy, because this was Nagaya to, he was a big industrialist within Russia, and the Russian government at the time acknowledged his contributions to the Russian land, to the Russian industry. So to be producing on that level, he had to have studied some formal studies relating to metallurgy in some formal fashion setting. It's not clear what exactly it was, whether it was a formal course with a degree, lav dafka. But this was a davar pashat. I'm not getting back into the whole chachmas chitzonius thing per se. It certainly was the tzorech parnasa. And the question, of course, would be bechlal, whether learning things like that really counts as chachmas chitzonius fully, properly, in my opinion, without getting into that. All right, here's someone that became an expert on the inyanim of metals. And the same goes for anyone. Everyone who ends up with parnasa usually becomes an expert on something. They become very knowledgeable of something in the Welt. And the more hands-on, the more you're dealing with real world items, not just an office job. So the more you learn about real life gashmistic parts of the world. So presumably, so again, Chassidus isn't telling you what line of work to go in and what you should learn and study about and become knowledgeable about, but the reality is people become knowledgeable about stuff, and Rebbe Rashab seems to be expressing that whatever you learn about can then be used in this way. And I would add even further, today it's fairly normal. You take your family to a museum here, to different educational stuff. Whether you're consciously trying to learn more about the world or you're not, but you're always picking up knowledge, ideas. Maybe you end up on a Wikipedia binge and you read a bunch of articles. So, the more you know about the Welt, this can be helpful. This can add to your hisbonenus, and that's what the Rebbe Rashab is expressing. That once you get it, then it's easy because whatever you encounter is great. It adds more. So is there a specific recommendation? Not necessarily, but whatever you know more about, presumably if you know more about it, probably demonstrates that you have a Mashiach, that you're interested in it. So if you have a Mashiach, you're interested in it, so that's more likely to be something that maybe you would enjoy being misbeinen in rather than something else. So if a person finds themselves drawn to that, so that could be a good thing in this context. Again, we're not going to recommend and say everyone should go study this. And even without that, whatever the Mittler Rebbe is describing is something that obviously, even without knowing specific knowledge, studying the apple, you know enough to know that there are a number of apples and they have different tastes and flavors, etc. And if you're an apple enthusiast and you know a lot more about apples, so then you have a lot more to think about. But again, I can't tell you, not here to say go study about the apple, but if you were to know more about the apple, then you would still be sort of going in line with what the Alter Rebbe, what Mittler Rebbe was saying, to be misbeinen in the apple. So that is my avana here, that is my interpretation here. Interestingly, I recently came across another passage in Torah Shalom. This is from Simchas Torah Tafar Samach Tes, page 140. And interestingly there, the Rebbe Rashab is also expressing something related to this. He says that hisbonenus is hislapshus, you're being melubish in whatever you're being misbeinen in. He says, "Ukamashal tzemeach hagashmi." It comes to something that grows, a plant. When you think about it, so by thinking about a plant, so that then gives you a comparative, a parallel ruchnistic atzir, and nemt areis telefon atzir ruchni. So the Rebbe Rashab also again seems to be talking about this idea of focusing on a gashmistic thing, maybe that you're interested in, that you connect to, that you relate to then use that as means to think about, to then build on that and reach what the equivalent ruchnistic tzir is. Till the gashmi becomes like a mashal to the nimshal. He says, for example, aye v'shar, a lion and an ox. So if you know about the aye and the shar, so from there you can reach and derive insights, beruchnius. So that's a slapshus. Then a bit further on, he repeats it again. Pnei aryeh, pnei shar, where again it seems to be saying that you start from the real aryeh and the real shar, and then from there you can derive pratim tzir in pnei aryeh, pnei shar. You start from the gashmi and you work your way up to the ruchni. But not just, we're not restricting it and saying these two. Anything in Daimon Samei Chaim Medaber that you could be Metzayer, Shu Koilo Klolos HaNevroim, Adei Magashmi, Hisigu, in Yonem Aruchnim HaMeflaim. Here, all of a sudden, the language shifts though a bit to Hisigu, they were Masig. Ad Shahaya Ki'ilu, Shahaya Lehem, Tzir Musig, Binyan HaGan Eden, Shehivinu Zem Yonem Gashmiyam. So it's not fully clear if this is fully a recommendation to everyone in the language here or not. And then in parentheses it says, Aleph Yud Yud, based on what we saw, what we heard, we knew who is being referred to, that they had the tzir. So it's not clear if he means people that were present or it's talking about historically. And then the Rebbe Rashab actually connects it overtly, directly to the Rambam and Ma'aser Bereshis, Ma'aser Merkava, which I found very interesting at the time when I saw it a week or two or three ago. He says, when the Rambam presented his model, his version of Ma'aseh Bereishis, Ma'aseh Merkava, he says Ma'aseh Bereishis is Mashemena Gashmi Hu Lekech in Yerukni. It's mamish this that you take from the Gashmi. So in the Rebbe Shab's interpretation of it is you use the Gashmi to be Mitzayer the Ruchni. And Ma'aseh Merkava is to go straight to the Ruchni without stopping to use the Gashmi as a means, as a method. So that's what the Rebbe Shab says there. So again, it's hard to know if it's being said outright as a phone recommendation, but based on being mitzvah of all these sources together, it does seem like it is sort of a recommendation. Obviously, again, no one can tell you to go. I don't think the Rebbe Shab holds that you should go study Ma'aseh Bereishis, Lefi Shittas Rambam, in order to learning the Shema, so I can be misbrainin in it. I don't know if I don't have the breitkeit to say that, but it seems like this is implied across these sources that if you happen to know about Inyan Gashmius Befratius, then being misbrainin in it and reaching the Inyan Beruchnius is sort of bridging the Rambam's idea of Ma'aseh Bereishis with Chassidus' idea of thinking about Inyan Beruchniim, and obviously it's supposed to come back to Inyan of Bittul. But even in this context, the Rebbe Shav isn't bringing it back to Bittul, just it's helping you be Mitzayer, a Ruchnistic thing, and that ties into a larger point that I was looking into recently, maybe I alluded to recently, the whole topic of hisbonenus and Chabad, without getting into it barichas on this occasion, but this idea of that it should be something vivid, and for it to be vivid, seemingly it has to be something that you can picture vividly, you can think about vividly. So for different people that could be different things, but what we're seeing here seemingly is that starting with Gashmias and the pratim of Inyanim Gashmiim could also be the basis for building on that, and whether it's Mitzayer and Inyan Ruchni, or to bring it and to compare it to Marabu Magadlus, if the Tainugim down here compared to the Tainugim up there, and then to bring it ultimately to the Bittul, that everything's Batal, Kula Kamei, Kula Chshiv. Now, at this point, we're a Maidach. I really wanted to share how I actually landed on this Sefer Chasid Shalom. It was based on looking at something else entirely. I was looking at a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, but I think we're sort of out of time here. I want to keep it to around an hour. That's the length we've been sticking to. Interestingly, in the source that I came across that led me to this, it literally said fakert, that the Rebbe Rashab once said that there are certain things that von früher verstehen, wie das ist lamaila, and then lefi zeh kann man verstehen, wie es ist lamata. And I found the parallel to this, Dafka in the same sikha in Torah Shalom that we spoke about Barichas from Samachas, which is talking about thinking about the mata to reach the maila. Interestingly, there may be another point being made there in parallel that almost is fakert, to know the maila in order to understand the mata. But we don't have time to get into that. But one more point I will make, another topic that I've been interested in is thinking about the external knowledge, sort of the science that is incorporated into Chassidus itself. If you actually sit and evaluate what the Rebbeim are doing, we can see that the Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe in particular simply introduced a lot of musagim from Welt, lefi the ideas of the time. I think we touched on it a bit in some previous stuff earlier in the year, Kislev time, on the other channel. So there's this larger topic, this larger conversation to be had about the ideas and the sources that the Rebbeim use, and how they use it, and how it was incorporated. But if you start paying attention to all the places where the Alter Rebbe says, Sifrei HaTiviyim, etc., you'll find that the Alter Rebbe invokes this type of knowledge a lot. Now, is that an endorsement that everyone should go read Sifrei HaTiviyim? I don't think so. But perhaps it gives a window into the Rebbeim themselves sort of doing a version of this, applying knowledge that they already had, that they were already interested in for whatever reason, however they reached it, and finding ways to incorporate it back into the Chassidus, into their hisbonenus. Now, it happens to be that I've observed that it seems like once the Alter Rebbe Samach Tzedek finished, the later Rebbeim didn't seem to introduce new ideas, new chachmas, new external knowledge into Chassidus, but what we find often is that they did it externally. They didn't do it in the Maimer, they did it in the Sikha. So we find that Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe, even the Rebbe Marash, to whatever extent we know about him, they certainly took a certain interest in the world, and they, again, I don't know if it's appropriate to cite their own behavior, their own activity, the things that they did, going to museums or things like that. But like I said, to go and say I'm going to go to the museum because al pi Chassidus kommt that I should go to the museum because the Rebbeim did it, that's not so beseder. But plenty of people, like I said, you take your family to the museum anyway for Chol Hamoed, for a trip. So if you're going to the museum anyway, so instead of saying severing and disconnecting and saying, okay, this has no connection to my spiritual world. So growing up, so we were taught that you should find the Hira and Avodas Hashem from everything. So that's perhaps on a lower level you can look for Hiras. But from all these Makaitis, it seems to paint the picture that if you go to a museum and you learn about whatever topic the museum focuses on, so the Alter Rebbe would have put it into the Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab and others, they wouldn't put it into the Chassidus, but they would talk about it in a Sikha. What we can learn from that, what we can derive from that in different ways and different means that we've described. So, certainly the same should be true for a person, not on the darg of a maimer, not on the darg of a sikha, but on the darg of personalizing what a person wants to think about. It certainly seems, based on all of the above, that this would be in keeping with the spirit of what Chassidus is talking about, and that is a means of achieving the Avas Olam that's described here in the maimer in Bahal Ischa.